I too would like to begin with thanks to Father Kale and to Nadia for organizing a really rich conference, and also for your incredible hospitality. This is my second visit to Villanova, and it's been just as good as the first. So thank you so much for your hospitality to all of us. I'm a big hoops fan as well, so I also am very happy for Villanova, but I'm also a big NBA fan, not just a college fan. So I'm really happy to see that the Philadelphia 76ers seem to be on the upswing after years of the process. And for those of you who follow the Sixers, you'll know what I mean, even though I'm a Celtics fan. And then finally, before I begin, I want to congratulate anyone here who's named Nicholas, Nicolette, or some variant of those names, since you're celebrating today St. Nicholas feast day, who was a Greek Orthodox saint from Asia Minor, who has now been reduced to the consumerist version of Santa Claus in the United States, or to a Turkish religious figure by the regime in Ankara. So with that, I begin. Current policy discussions and scholarship on the subject of this conference, Christians in the Contemporary Middle East, have arrived, I think, belatedly to a shared consensus about the indisputable trend lines indicating the steady decline and possible elimination of the presence of Christianity in the Middle East. More specifically, qualitative and quantitative data provide incontrovertible evidence that both living Christianity, by that I mean Christian communities, peoples, as well as structural Christianity, by that I mean religious and cultural sites, churches, monasteries, schools, libraries, cemeteries, artifacts such as icons, art, texts, ephemera, and manuscripts, are disappearing through either targeted destruction or benign neglect. Even in cases where the numbers are not at near extinction levels, for example, in Israel, where Christians comprise an estimated 6 to 8% of the population, or in Syria, where pre-war Christian numbers were about 10% of the population, or in Egypt, where Christians comprise approximately 20% of the population. But certainly in cases of near extinction, for example, in Turkey, where Christians today comprise only 0.5% of the population, or in Iraq, where Christian communities have declined in the space of 13 years from about 1.5 million to 200,000. In all of these cases, communities suffer from severe constraints on their human security and from various types of violations of their fundamental civil and political liberties, including freedom of religion, conscience, and belief. In this context, Mideast Christians increasingly preside over what some have referred to as museum faiths, and they live in enclaved, whether physically or psychologically, in enclaved conditions in societies that are characterized by policymakers and in a lot of scholarship in essentialized reductionisms, such as the Muslim world, the Arab-Israeli Middle East, the Arab world. These essentialist reductions of the Middle East in such labels invariably position Christians as minorities, with associated implications as latecomers, interlopers, foreign implants by Western imperialists and/or crusaders, and these labels deliberately misrepresent and ignore the historical reality that Christians in and of the East are organic, indigenous, multilingual, multi-ethnic communities present in the region since antiquity. They're part of the fabric of the region. Furthermore, whether we're talking about either relatively sizable communities or tiny remnant communities, Christian communities in the Middle East all reside in states whose governments have shared a similar approach since the establishment of states in the early part of the 20th century in engaging with Christian citizens. Specifically, we see states using violent and nonviolent, active and passive mechanisms that define and marginalize Christians as minorities and that make it impossible for them to sustain themselves economically. State actors have presided over physical deterioration, destruction, expropriation, and appropriation and repurposing of Christian properties, individual and collective. And finally, states have collaborated either explicitly by policies of commission or implicitly by policies of omission with non-state actors or in the face of societal attacks against Christians to create a climate of impunity. In a word, to put it simply, the exit or out-migration of Christians under conditions of political marginalization and economic non-sustainability and a legal and security climate of impunity has led to their current condition, at risk, to use the Human Rights Watch phrase. And with the destruction of sites that Brian referenced earlier, or hopefully the effort to preserve sites, we also see a process of eliminating not only living Christianity, but any physical remnants and expressions of Christian presence, namely a process that abets and aids memoricide. Now, Christian leaders across the three major denominations, Eastern and Oriental Orthodox, Roman Latin, Maronite, and Chaldean Catholic, and mainline and evangelical Protestant, understand the politics of the term minorities, and they reject the categorization, other than as a numerical descriptor and as a policy conversation shorthand. It's fair to argue that Christians in the region understand themselves rightly as organic to the region. And certainly at the societal and even in some instances political level, Christians have been viewed by their non-Christian, Muslim majority and Jewish neighbors as part of the region. But that doesn't change the facts on the ground. And it certainly doesn't change some of the things we've heard over the last few days and this morning, namely that the trend lines are decidedly negative, and that these are trend lines that are not a function of the collapse of Iraq, the war in Syria. They're a function of nearly a century of statehood in the region, and they're a function of deeper historical processes, the longue durée of history. Now, this is a very grim introduction. It's deliberately stylized and quite black and white, but again, I would argue that the facts on the ground support this profile. So what I'd like to do in the time that remains to me is to address two questions. First, what are the primary geopolitical factors that help to understand these trend lines and dynamics in order to think about whether or not it's possible to alter the directionality of Christian decline and erasure? And then second, I'd like to think about how the conceptual category and the operational space of Eurasia helps us to understand these geopolitical factors and the way they've impacted the sustainability of Mideast Christians. My goal here is to explore the geopolitics of Eurasia in two regards. First, as an international system of state power relations, and second, as an epistemic framework or a kind of cultural geopolitics, and looking at the way in which the power politics of states and the cultural geopolitics have interacted. I think we begin to understand better the causes of the trend lines that I talked about at the outset. And I'm going to be very synoptic moving forward as follows. First, let me give you a brief review of the geopolitical tradition and international relations theory and practice, looking at geographies of power projection and force and geographies of cultural representation, thinking about their implications for Middle East Christianity. And then second, I want to look at a couple of cases, that of Syria and Turkey, to explore the specific impacts of this geopolitics of Eurasia on Middle East Christians. And then if there's some time, I'll say a few things about takeaways. Now, geopolitics. What is it? It's a term we use all the time, but what is geopolitics and how does it help us to think about Christianity in the Middle East? The tradition of geopolitics, although it's been mostly associated with international relations theory, actually grows out of a cross-disciplinary convergence between history, political science, geography, and more recently, critical theory. The genealogy of geopolitics as an intellectual tradition and as a mode of state strategy has gone through various permutations and reconfigurations since its inceptions in the late 19th century. But there are some defining features of what have come to be understood as both the classical and critical schools. Now, the classical school of geopolitics originated in the late 19th, early 20th century with Euro-American thinkers. And classical geopolitics emerged as a theory about how geography is implicated in politics, and especially in the political relationships between and among states, and in particular in terms of the projection of force and competition among states. So from European theorists such as Friedrich Ratzel, who was a German, and his student Rudolf Kellen, Swedish, to Anglo-American theorists such as Halford Mackinder, British, and Alfred Thayer Mahan, American, classical geopolitical thinkers were concerned with state control over geography and borders, and most especially, in an argument encapsulated in Halford Mackinder's seminal thesis, they were concerned about, and they argued, that global hegemony depended on control over the heartland of Eurasia. And Mackinder understood Eurasia as what Brzezinski later came to call as an axial supercontinent, a supercontinent that lay at the core of what he also called the world island, that comprised three interlinking continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa. And while Mackinder and his cohort may have differed over the means of control over Eurasia, economic, military, political, the technological means used to control Eurasia, the focus on land routes or sea choke points, these classical geopolitical thinkers gave primacy of place to geography as the key to state hegemony and as the key to the geography of control over Eurasia as the sine qua non for global hegemony. You might ask me, what does this have to do with the condition of Christians in the Middle East? Now, insofar as geography was central to these arguments about global dominance, and because Eurasia was the geographical and remains the geographical epicenter of these arguments, which have enjoyed quite a revitalization in the post-Cold War period, late Cold War and post-Cold War period, a look at the map and the place of the Middle East in this school of international relations, strategy, and power politics begins to help us understand our story about the condition of Christians in the region. First of all, geopolitical strategy and models emerged clearly at the time of the dissolution of the massive transcontinental European Asian empires, Habsburg, Ottoman, and Russian. So geopolitical thinking was designed to produce models or paradigms that would support and ultimately lead to outcomes that would support the intense, violent military and economic competition for control over these successor states and the territories that came out of these empires. Those successor states involved, of course, those of the Middle East, whose geostrategic value lay and continues to be viewed as lying in their positioning along the Eurasian rimland, the connector space of the Mediterranean and southeastern Europe to the entire European continent, the Asian continent, and to the Eurasian regions of the Russian lands, the Caucasus, and the Indian subcontinent and Far East. Second, classical geopolitics, in identifying Eurasia and control over borders, necessarily raised the issue of the foundational border. Where does Europe begin? Where does Asia begin? And in this regard, the Middle East, part of the East, fell on the Asian side of the border, more specifically on the non-European side of a border whose geographic competition meant control over this large axial supercontinent and global hegemony. So in this regard, classical geopolitics began to draw on and develop full-blown, in terms of contemporary critical geopolitics, an understanding of state competition that rested on two geographical cultural imaginaries, Europe and Asia, which became signifiers, symbols, and shorthands, the binaries we all know, West and East, Occident and Orient, modern and traditional, progressive and backward, secular and religious. Ultimately, these kind of binaries began to be reduced to Christianity and Islam, where Christianity fits with Europe and all the other equivalents of Europe, and Islam fits with the Orient and and Asia and all of the other equivalents. So these cultural geographies began to be developed and expanded in a historiography that positioned Europe and Western Christianity at the center of a set of interlocking social science paradigms of modernization and secularization. So to sum up here, cultural geopolitics and their associated epistemic frameworks led to a kind of rewriting of Christianity and the history of Christianity. A rewriting that wrote out the Christianity in and of the East, so that pre-schism, if we want to use those terms, Christianity, was written out of a treatment of the emergence of modernity and the spread of modernity that ultimately it was linked to competitive state power geopolitics. This meant the writing out of Christians in the East, for example, Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian Christians, writing out four of the five ancient patriarchates of the Pentarchy and occluding them into a larger opaque space of the Orient, associated with an equally essentializing treatment of Russia, Islam, and everything that was marked by geopolitical otherness and threat to the unmarked categories of the European West. Now, let me offer two examples to try to concretize some of these general claims, and let me take them to Turkey and talk a little bit about Turkey and Syria when it comes to geopolitics, the projection of force, state competition and control, but ultimately these cultural geopolitical imaginaries as well, and think about the impact on Christians. And again, given time, I'm going to stick mainly to the period from the establishment of states in the region, so the last 100 years, or slightly less than 100 years, but again, I think there are larger historical continuities at work here in the way these arguments play out and geopolitics plays out on the ground. Now, in terms of Turkey, here's a state whose geostrategic importance to Europe and eventually to the Euro-Atlantic Alliance and the objectives of control over Eurasia has defined the realities of Christians in the country. Turkey's geostrategic value, a territorial connector between Europe and Asia. In fact, so much so that discussions about Turkey's EU membership couldn't agree on whether or not Turkey is a European power. 6% of territorial Turkey lies on the European continent, just as a factoid here. So Turkey's geostrategic value as a territorial connector between Europe and Asia, between Southeastern Europe and Asia Minor, between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe and Asia. Turkey's geostrategic value to European and NATO control over the waterways and land routes, and especially access to oil and natural gas resources stretching from the Eastern Mediterranean to the Transcaucasus, has been the determinant factor, I would argue, in the decline of Christians and their lands of origin in Turkey, and to the point of near extinction. Why do I say that? Because precisely in terms of what I've just articulated, Turkey's geopolitical value in terms of a territory from which force can be projected on three continents, and in which competition over control over the Eurasian heartland, and more generally, Eurasia as a transaxial continent, has led to the following when it comes to Christians. The hard geopolitics of force projection and control over natural resources has meant that the cultural geopolitics, historiography, appropriation and destruction, and state policies of Turkey's Christians have largely gone either unnoticed or backgrounded to these other kinds of geopolitics. Eastern Christians, Greek Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, Syriac Orthodox, have largely been eliminated from Turkey. There are 1,750 Greek Orthodox Christians today in Turkey. There are 60,000 Armenians in Turkey, about 30,000 Syriac Orthodox in Turkey, and depending on the numbers, because it's difficult to get numbers, anywhere between 7 to 25,000 combined Roman Catholic and Protestant communities in Turkey. Therefore, that number of 0.5%. All of this is, of the decline of the Christian presence in Turkey has really been the function of either the willful ignorance of European and U.S. powers competing for control in the Eurasian heartland. They have supported the facile notion that Kemalist secularism built democracy in Turkey. Therefore, Christians, if anyone took notice, were living in a secular democracy. These geopolitical priorities have also supported the notion that the neo-Ottoman AKP was a Turkish model for all Muslim democracies in the Middle East. And I use this policy language quite deliberately, reinforcing the essentialist reduction of the Middle East to Islam, and therefore perpetuating the notion of Asia as the binary opposite of Europe. And also, by the way, insulting non-Turkish Arab Muslims by suggesting that their once Ottoman overlords continued to hold the key to Arab modernization, that is, democratization. In any event, through the Cold War, in the post-Cold War period, geopolitical priorities over real estate, and Turkey, as it's all about real estate, Turkey's geostrategic location in this geopolitics of Eurasia, meant that the cultural geography of Turkey was largely ignored or rewritten, so that Christian communities there were either written out of contemporary discussions about Turkey as a Muslim democracy or a secular democracy. That's the first case. The second case that I'd like to talk a little bit about is Syria, and look at how the impact of both classical and critical geopolitics on Christians in Syria has played itself out. This impact has been very complex and obviously well beyond the confines of the talk, but I think some basic points are instructive. Now, without a doubt, Syria in the 20th century is part of the post-Ottoman territorial settlement and then European colonial competition over the Near East has been focused on access to, geopolitics there has been focused on access to and leverage over a state whose geographic location is undeniably critical to control over naval and land routes linking Eurasia and the rimland connectors of the Mediterranean and Africa. During the Cold War and since the end of the Cold War and into the Civil War period, if we can talk in these terms now, the geography of Syria has been relevant in terms of US-Soviet competition and then and now US-Russian competition. And more recently in terms of US-Russian patronage for Saudi-Iranian/Sunni Shia competition over the territory of Syria, which is understood by all parties as important for power projection in Eurasia. Christians in Syria have been largely irrelevant to these iterations of classical geopolitics. As two US congressional champions of religious freedom who know well the condition of Christians in Syria and Iraq said to me on one occasion, most Americans, and I would extend this to Europeans, really have no idea that there are Christians in Syria. They had no idea until the civil war in Syria. And although a general statement, I think it's one that anecdotally at least is supportable. The cultural geography of Syria, I think, has been overdetermined by reductionism to Syria as an essentially Muslim space where geopolitical discussions about religion have been either reduced to Sunni Shia, Sunni Alawite, majority-minority competition, and where any mention of Christians comes in terms of military calculations that go somehow along the following lines. Christians are willing collaborators with the al-Assad regimes, father and son, and therefore they can be written off because of the Assad-Iran linkages. Or Christians are potential tools of an expansionist Russia, whose Putin regime has instrumentalized Orthodox Christianity in order to serve Russian expansionist interests into the Middle East, and therefore to serve Russia's geopolitical competition with NATO over control of Eurasia. Again, rendering Orthodox, but by extension all Christians, suspect and able to be written off because somehow they're associated with the other in an essentialized Asian East. Islam is the one other, Eastern Christianity is the other, Eastern and Oriental. So these are the two examples. I give you these basic data points to consider. This is obviously a very synoptic treatment of an incredibly complex phenomenon. And so my interest has been in beginning to think about how the practice of geopolitics, both as the linkage between geography and power projection on the one hand, as well as geopolitical imaginaries, cultural imaginaries, has affected the condition and the presence of Christians in the Middle East. I'm also interested as a political scientist who reads a lot of history, religion, and sociology in thinking about how the epistemic frameworks, interlocking epistemic frameworks of international relations, geopolitics on the one hand, and modernization, secularization theory in political and science and sociology have been internalized, absorbed, and deployed by policymakers in ways that are oftentimes factually incorrect and that have had profoundly negative human rights and humanitarian consequences for Christians in the Middle East. And I want to generalize beyond this in a moment in some takeaways. First of all, takeaways. We need to remine and rewrite the history of Christians in the Middle East in a way that moves beyond the epistemic straitjacket of modernization and secularization theory, and in a way, therefore, that by extension, by necessity, moves away from the Eurocentric narrative of Christianity that omits the rich, if fractious and highly contentious, even sometimes violent, history of early Christianity associated with a unified church. I suppose we could reduce that to the 7 ecumenical councils, but there are other ways to think about it. But looking at Christianity, East and West. Secondly, I think there's a paradox at work here that's consequent to the geopolitical competition in Eurasia as it has affected Middle East Christians. And the paradox is this. A recognition of the at-risk condition of Christians in the Middle East has actually generated renewed connections, new kinds of scholarships, and certainly new kinds of humanitarian and human rights cooperation across the various Christian, what we can call Christian denominations. And we see a renewed recognition of Christianity's diversity and unity, or if you will, unity and diversity. In other words, a recognition of the historical and contemporary roots of Christianity as a plural religious tradition. And we see this in many ways, in terms of renewed ecumenical contacts between Pope Francis and Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople. We see it more generally in the Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian dialogue and cooperation in terms of provision of human rights needs on the ground. We see it with other kinds of indicators, for example, the denominational conversation amongst Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Protestant Christians who've come to see the irony in a Christian fragmentation and inter-Christian competition that's only accelerated the demise of Christians in their historical lands of origin. Third point, discussions about the decline of Christians have given more attention to a geopolitics of power in the Middle East, forced projection and material interests that has given traction to authoritarian forms of nationalism, both secular and religious alike, in ways that have also reinforced the essentialization of the region. A region that is either, again, the Arab Middle East, the Muslim Middle East, the East, therefore unable to modernize by that, accomplish a democratic form of nationalism. And so what's happening on the ground as pluralism, Christians being a bellwether of the broader processes of the homogenization, religious and cultural homogenization of the region, has been a recognition of the need to re-examine and critique the geopolitics of power and the cultural geopolitics that have been the handmaiden of that geopolitics of power in Eurasia. The fourth point, the impact of this geopolitics, cultural and political, on Christians in the region, but more generally, again, on the prospects for pluralism in the region, has generated massive mixed and forced migration flows from the Eastern Mediterranean into Europe, reinforcing an awareness of the interconnectedness of Europe and Asia, this notion of a Eurasian axial supercontinent, but in ways that have driven home the unintended and the ugly human rights and humanitarian consequences of geopolitical priorities that background human rights regimes, human rights considerations, what the United States would call a foreign policy of values, and the way in which the impact in one part of Eurasia has an impact on the other, and has reinforced a recognition that religious pluralism is a phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon, and it's one that can either be embraced by support for rule of law and human rights regimes, or it's one that can be crippled by looking at hard power interests, but the consequences are not regionally contained. And then finally, it's also worth mentioning that the revival of the geopolitical tradition has been equally remarkable in US-European strategic policy as it has been in Russian strategic policy under the Putin regime. There's an entire Eurasianist school, neo-Eurasianist school, that's been hard at work in trying to connect Russian revisionism and expansionism with Orthodox theology, so that the Middle East has become, again, a geographic space for geopolitical contestation of control over Eurasia that deploys and uses religion in ways that have had very adverse consequences for Christianity in the region. Thank you.